You know, something after QAnon. I mean, if one thing is QAnon, if it's being rebranded, that's one thing. But there's just going to be another conspiracy narrative that again, based on all the kind of available psychographic profiles that one can glean from these networks, that you could just manufacture another narrative and just use the same old tropes and have different villains.
Yep.
But I think that's why it's so important to have this conversation.
I think one of the things that Into the Storm tries to do is to point out that this is not just, you know, people sitting around in their basement hanging out on 8chan or 8kun or whatever reading posts, but from a guy showing up at a pizza parlor with an AR-15 to the shootings at Christchurch. And Byron, you mentioned the underlying racism that is reflected in what is going on with many of these people, and then draw the line through January 6th and the insurrection, the attack on the Capitol, with 5 people dead and people running around, you know, saying hang Mike Pence and looking to kill our Democratic, the plots to kill the governor of Michigan. I mean, we're in a place where the FBI says the greatest threat to the homeland now is this kind of domestic extremism and terrorism. And so it's not just rhetoric, right? It's leading to these behaviors and encouraging these behaviors that have absolutely terrible implications for society. And I don't know. I mean, I wish I knew. I wish I had a crystal ball. When I first heard about QAnon, I'm like, oh, okay. So Satan worshiping, baby eating people running around controlling the government in a deep state. That's really an idea that's going to take off. But it did, right?
Yeah. And
it's worrisome.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, Steve. And you know, I think one of the issues, you know, for me to thinking about tackling the problem of this kind of misinformation, and even in this conversation so far, it seems like we're centering kind of the notion of this false information and of the people who are creating this type of information, right? So I wonder what it would be like to decenter that, right? To decenter Q, to decenter false information, right? To really decenter, because I have to go back to this, right? For me, this ideology is built upon whiteness.
Totally.
that Q spreads, right? And so I wonder, can you decenter that one whiteness in the information, and also decenter, you know, this notion of truth, right? Or false information. So I'll call it false information / truth, because it is a truth for some of them, right? How do we, excuse me, how would we decenter, if that makes any sense, right? What I'm trying to ask here.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Mm-hmm. When you say decenter, are you talking about like it being central to identities? Like is that what we're?
I think it's central to identities, but also central to an institution, right? So I think institutional and identity. So I think it's both of those things. I'm just thinking about, there was an article, I was looking at some stuff the other night. What's the name of that journal? First Amendment Journal or something, I think, because there's an episode, First Amendment Studies. There's one of the episodes in the HBO series is looking at, and Nathan and Steve Rahko, I think you both have talked about this, looking at the First Amendment right? In this notion, this freedom of speech and kind of the act that came out of something with dealing with the internet or something. But I wonder, is this an opportunity to think about how we decenter this kind of norm? Because I think that false information has become kind of a norm, right? How can we decenter that as an institutional thing, but also as identity? Because with watching that, the documentary, I think a lot of that's tied up in identity. And I know what I wanted to think, what I wanted to say. So I know Steve Rahko, a little while ago, you said something about this notion of, one of you said something about this notion of power, right? I think I would push back a little bit and say, these people who started QAnon, I think they are powerful. And I say that from a position of blackness, of being black, to these people being white. There is power there. They had the power to create this nonsense, right? So there's a level of power that exists within that. And I think we have to really think about how are they able to create all this, right? And like Steve Hunt just said, we all were probably thinking, yeah, these crazy little conspiracy things, but how that grew, there's some kind of power there, right? There's some kind of power that exists there. And I think that we can't effectively think about QAnon and the issues with QAnon and the issue of mistruths without thinking about decentering this notion of power with, of the way we think about power, right? So I don't know. I think it's just, I'm thinking about what are the ways that we start talking about solutions, because like I've said, they want to move on to something else, right? This notion of getting into local politics, which will grow into larger forms of politics, right? And the dangers of that, because they've already got so many people, and we can't be foolish enough to think that these people won't win elections, right? I mean, their conspiracy theories won over a lot of people, so it's quite possible they win elections. So I guess I'm just thinking about now, what are the ways that we start thinking about, I hate to use the word combating this, but, trying to figure out how do we navigate, right, through this? What are the ways that we navigate through a Q era? Because I think that's what we're in, is a conspiracy era.
So the first thing I want to do is respond to your notion that this is about whiteness. And in the world that I live in and experience, you're absolutely right.
I should say whiteness and power.
Well, it's exactly. The destabilization of whiteness is how I tend to refer to it. And I want to just put something out there. It's not necessarily what I believe. I just want to hear how it interacts with your expertise. So on the one hand, we have a group of people that are expressing agency at many scales, belonging to this group that I believe in the end is sort of defending a belief, some sort of whiteness mythology or whatever. So what about the whiteness on the other side? And what I mean is, when the white response on the other side is predominantly to argue metaphysics regarding truth,
Mm-hmm.
what is that buying that group? And what I would put out there is that it's buying that group a certain space that its rationalism has bought it, at least post-Reagan. And that is, once we can go metaphysical and claim that the other side is just wrong for analytic, rational reasons, then there's nothing we can do because they can't be persuaded. And since we don't like to talk about combat, we like to talk about metaphysics and right and wrong, we, in a sense, remove ourselves from the issue. And then what does that do? It keeps that whiteness with its power and its wealth. So I'm not saying I believe that, but it's just a way I've thought about things. And if it's a non-starter, it's a non-starter. But what's the other side doing? How are they dealing with this in terms of their whiteness?
I could certainly respond to that, but is there anybody who wants to respond to Scott first?
Go ahead.
Okay, so Scott, you've raised this point a couple times in this conversation, and I'm ready to kind of interrogate this as well. So, I'm from my training in as a rhetorical critic is largely grounded in kind of postmodern, post-structural thinking, and in dialogue with the rhetorical canon going back to the classical era. And I think that going back to the classical era, there's always been this kind of tension between sophistry and truth, and this is sort of a thread that goes through our kind of 20th century continental tradition as well, right? I mean, you see it in a debate with, obviously the postmodernists. You see it especially in Nietzsche, and also Habermas and the like. And this has been a line of inquiry that I've been interested in a long time. And I think it actually becomes, on the one hand, very helpful, and on the other hand, kind of it represents a stasis point. And I say that because, I am convinced that the best way to deal with a phenomenon like QAnon is that, I think you're putting on the table what we have to think about, and we have to take very seriously. I think the person that comes to mind based on what you're describing is the literary critic Terry Eagleton. In his book on literary criticism, he says, one of the problems with the bourgeoisie is that they in the modern era, they really subscribe to what he calls a kind of crude empiricism, right? And really doing what you're describing, and that is this: you're not going to persuade anybody who subscribes to these kinds of beliefs or any belief system by just trying to negate it by fact checking, right? That appeals to a particular sensibility of a particular kind of audience, and it's not going to necessarily appeal to all people, right? And I think that when we're thinking about this crisis that we're dealing with, the left or liberals generally, I think, offer two kind of responses that are endemic to their own kind of experience, maybe their own phenomenology, to use a term that you like to use, which again is a critical kind of line of thinking in all of this, how one experiences being. And they generally, I mean, if you think about like the general responses, it's going to be an ironic response, a la The Daily Show, right? We'll kind of just satirize them, we'll mock them. Or it's this alternative of the kind of move to realism, right? Like documentary style realism, right? We're going to show them what the truth is. They think this, but really it's this. And I think the problem with our era, with Trumpism, with the QAnon phenomenon, is that, these two approaches run up against their limits. Right. And I think we can interrogate why, but they're not as effective at deconstructing this as I think liberals would like to believe. And I think that that's part of the crisis here, is that we need a new aesthetic. We need a new we need a new discourse. We need new rhetorical strategies. We need to confront these audiences in a different way than these kind of conventional popular modes of address. And that's where, again, there needs to be some new thinking. There needs to be ingenium, to use Latin. There needs to be an invention. We need to think about this differently, because, I don't think that, again, a theorist that I've been very influenced by is Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche has a famous unpublished essay called Truth and Lies. And I've always found his approach to thinking about rhetoric very, very important. And I think that for this kind of a crisis, it becomes very important to think about this, right? That we don't really have any kind of omnipotent God point of view, right? And we have to understand that, they are coming to these sets of experiences. They're coming to current events, right? They're coming to these mediums, right, with their own kind of frame of reference, their worldview. And they're looking for confirmation, right? There is a confirmation bias there. But we have to recognize that we have to understand the frame, and we have to understand as my advisor, Bob Ivy put, we have to find strategies for expanding the frame to complicate their worldviews. And that's not easy. But I don't see any other way out of it, because just satirizing them, making fun of them, or just sort of trying to like shame them and dupe them into thinking, well, actually, no, it's really this. You're just, that's not going to work. And I don't think it will work. And in fact, it only repulses them more because it just encourages them to go into their own online communities or their own faith communities. And then to just sort of like, again, it just sort of like encourages them to kind of reinforce their own worldview because they think they're under siege.
No, their skin gets thicker. I mean, it's just, absolutely. No, I agree with everything you just said. Totally. Go ahead, Nathan.
I really like that what would you say, complicating their worldviews, right? If we're thinking about circuit breakers or some way of modulating, I mean, that's another like metaphor in network studies, like modulation of communication, like that to me makes sense, right? It I don't know, disrupts certain kinds of spreads, or it changes, where or how a particular message is going to get distributed throughout the rest of the network. And I think that makes sense. But like you're saying, that's really, really hard. And I think to follow up on what you mentioned too about the kind of the paradigms we have right now for dealing with these issues, right? So Illinois just announced like a media literacy education component of what was it, Steve? High schools, or is it all curriculum? I can't remember. I have to go look this
K-12.
up. K through 12. Oh gosh, so it's like all public education in Illinois, and I think the challenge is like we hear media literacy just thrown about like nothing. It's like critical thinking, right? Like these are terms that have almost no meaning anymore because they get adopted and absorbed into whatever people want to make them, right? The far left and the far right all have their own media literacy programs, right? Like this is it's a way of training people to, basically be inoculated against the other's propaganda, right? And I think that's another concept, like inoculation, or I think we hear of like viral spread, it's a disease that's out there. And these are all like really unhelpful paradigms, right? I was laughing, like just thinking about like even the idea of inoculation, like, oh, we've got to inoculate people against the, conspiracies that are forming. It's like, you can't even get them to get shots against COVID. Of course it's not going to work, right? So again, when we think about new paradigms, that expansion of worldview and like, I don't know, to drop a word that we're all pretty familiar with, right? Like some form of empathy, whatever that looks like, I don't know how effective that is, right? But I think that's important, and you're spot on, Steve, with that idea of reshaping that discourse. And again, I don't know what that's going to take, but I think we have to stop talking about inoculating people against fake news. Like we've got to move on. That's just not a helpful place to be anymore.
So to continue that thread, their skin gets thicker, and the purpose of that skin getting thicker is to completely justify the lack of empathy. I mean, they're shorts. When people get into these spaces where they buy into these post-racial fantasies or whatever it is they're buying into, part of what they're buying is a lack of empathy. They're buying a rhetoric that makes them feel good while they simultaneously ignore trauma. And so it's never just all by itself. It's always relational culturally. It's always indicates what they're avoiding. And the more robustly they lean into it, the more obvious it is what they're avoiding. And this goes back to Byron's comment about this is all about the destabilization of whiteness. Yes, for me, it's just obvious. I don't need to listen for more than 3 minutes to see what's being ignored, right? So you're absolutely right about it. And then the question is, if I would argue that we on the left or whatever that is, need to have a little more honest conversation about what we are, right? And what are we keeping the same by the lives we're living? And this goes back to my comment about if all I'm going to do is say they're wrong and they're stupid. Now, on the one hand, I'm doing the same thing. What I'm saying is I'm not going to try to understand them. And what happens is I get to sustain my privilege just like they sustain their privilege because we're all ignoring it. So for me, I see a lot of the work that like we're doing in this conversation, a lot of stuff we did in the Extended Empathy Project, trying to reorganize this way of thinking about how we're with each other. I call it narrative pluralism, but that's just, scholarly 6-syllable language. But the idea of becoming increasingly comfortable with empathy and uncertainty, whatever that means, however to cultivate that. And of course, just have a more just society, guys, so we don't make ourselves vulnerable to this kind of stuff. I mean, you just, Steve Rahko, you mentioned earlier about these rhetorics providing or propaganda providing a way to deal with technology. Well, that's exactly what Hitler did with the Autobahn and the railroads. And, the German culture was in a depression, so he capitalized on that space. Another example of the fear of the demise of whiteness, right? And brought people into the radio age and brought people into the Industrial Revolution in this sort of propaganda-driven way. So I think we're seeing a recapitulation of what we saw, in Germany in the 30s. And I'll stop there.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Steve Rahko. You want to say something?
I was going to say, just to kind of add on, I think the other thing that what the thread between this time and other kinds of eras is that there is a breakdown of the social order. There's a breakdown of capitalism, or maybe depending on how you look at it, capitalism kind of becomes intensified to the point that it kind of propels its own kind of self-destruction. I mean, again, depending on whatever kind of theory of this you want to look at.
Right.
But I think the thread here is that there's enough of a breakdown caused by inequality and other kinds of divisions that then creates the groundswell for these kinds of narratives to become very popular. And I think that one of the things that jumps out, I can't remember what episode of the HBO series it was. I think it actually might have been the first one. But there's this, when you're thinking about the kind of QAnon propaganda that's out there, and again, I mean, maybe one thing that would be helpful would be not to kind of like add to their metrics, but it may be helpful to actually watch these QTubers and to see, well, what exactly is this subtext or this underlying kind of, narrative to them? And it's not saying, I mean, we know what the narrative is. It's whiteness. It's not, but there was one particular part of the documentary where they were showing something, they were showing a part of this. And what was fascinating to me was that it was almost like an advertisement. And it went along like this, like, have you ever wondered why there's always poverty and there's always this growing inequality? And so the problem here is that, QAnon becomes a way of trying to explain things that frankly, the left has been fighting for years, but it's like the left doesn't get any credit. And that's the thing that becomes very frustrating to me. I think this was one of the other things that goes back to the 2016 election that I found really problematic, is that, there was just this sort of like the media narrative around Trump and Bernie Sanders was, well, they're just populists. Well, there's quite a difference. I mean, one's a populism that's trying to kind of like actually strengthen kind of the social bonds and create a new kind of social contract. The other populism is deeply apocalyptic. And I think there was a deep, and I think the other thing that became so frustrating about the reception of Trump was, that Trump was kind of given credit for speaking to the forgotten person, so to speak. Well, I mean, I don't understand why these fascists are getting credit for speaking to the malaise of the masses when these very people were benefiting from all these globalization, deindustrialization, austerity measures, that it was people on the left that were opposing this from the beginning. You know, and I've always found that to be very frustrating too. And again, I think that when we're thinking about what narratives, what techniques work, you know, they're responding to this era where everybody is clearly, you know, seeing a decline in their well-being, and to the extent that this is still a majority white culture. And if you have enough white people that are kind of in the plunge, well, then this narrative, and then the attempt to kind of, you know, redeem whiteness in its symbolic place as this kind of like racial other is taking it, becomes all the more persuasive to these people. And again, I think it means that, you know, we're in a moment now where there has to be a response in terms of policy more than ever, because otherwise it's just laying the groundswell for this to get worse. And again, you're always going to have this element there. But again, it's empowered by these social conditions.
The Lincoln Project. In other words, Republicans came to the left and taught us how to make a commercial, right? And it goes back to Byron's comment earlier about, I don't want to say the word combat, right? At the same time, when we keep throwing out satire and analytic accuracy, those aren't going to do anything. As you said, they're just going to make the skin thicker. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was making me think of that point. And again, the QAnon documentary from HBO, Into the Storm. I want to say this was either episode 5 or 6, but they brought on one of those like founding members of Anonymous, right? Not QAnon, but Anonymous, who was making a lot of those arguments, Steve, about like again, like what the heck is the left doing to counter any of this, right? Like, and he's like, why aren't they like fighting? Why aren't they getting dirty? I think were his like exact words, right? Like meeting them where they're at rather than trying to take a high road, and so. Here's one of those really, really hard parts as somebody who's in communication, right? I mean, we have these ethical credos and standards that our professional organizations, you know, put out there. And you know, when I see things like, and again, this even goes beyond QAnon. Again, just thinking about, you know, structures and networks of disinformation, like when I uncover stuff, like I can stand there on a mountaintop and scream and point it out, like this thing exists. Like everybody, look how awful this is, and spend all sorts of time deconstructing it and going on NPR to give interviews or you know, get quoted in a newspaper somewhere about it. But that effect is too little too late in almost every single case. It's like, hey, we found this disinformation network, but oh, by the way, you know, stories on it got shared 10,000 times throughout our community, and it's causing all this chaos. It's like why aren't we? Well, again, I don't want to propose this, but like again, what is it that holds the left back from similar disinformation networks? What is it that holds the left back from fighting dirty, so to speak, right? Rather than like you've been saying, like you know, maybe you already answered it, Scott, but this again, like analytical, privileged, you know, ivory tower whiteness, you know, in every
not even creating networks of disinformation, right? I mean, we're having this conversation today when President Biden was in Philadelphia earlier talking about the importance of voting rights, where a group of members of the House from Texas fled the state to go to Washington in order to make some kind of a move to prevent more voter suppression, and now have arrest warrants out for them, where the Major League All-Star game is being played tonight, right now as we speak, in Colorado, as it left Georgia because of the voting rights. I mean, it's not even like, do we need to create parallel universes of disinformation? Can we not just like figure out that screw the filibuster and let's take action in the Senate and pass some legislation that would address these issues? Yeah, it's you know, I'm sorry for my enthusiasm about all of that. It's just extremely frustrating to me.
But no, you're right, Steve. I mean, and this is where I think it has to go, and this is what I think people who are looking at, you know, issues of equity, need to go in the same direction, right? And I think you, for me, that nailed it. That hit the nail on the head. To me, it's and I know this wouldn't stop people from thinking the way they're thinking and being afraid of losing what they think they have. But this, legislation, policy change, really understanding and looking at and going back through and looking at these policies that have been in place and really thinking about, well, who created these policies? What were they thinking? Who were they leaving out? And I think that kind of, to me, that is like the new revolution, right? In the chat box, Nate and I had this thing. I said, the revolution, I was like, I got a way to confront them fools, right? And I said, the revolution will not be televised tonight. I said another word. And then Nathan said, but it will be on TikTok, right? But, there's something about, what would a revolution look like? And I don't mean revolution in this violent way, right? But what would it need to look like? Because I really don't see any other way of battling this misinformation rather than really coming up with something that maybe, I don't know how to say this, but takes that power away from the power of misinformation. Because I think this misinformation is very powerful in that it creates, it's building and it's creating a movement of sorts. I guess I'm at a space in my life now where I think movements and protests are important, but I don't know how much of a change those things make. I'm questioning that now. I think what makes change is, demanding new legislation, demanding new policy. And that could include this notion of, I think we really need to examine the notion of the freedom of speech, right? And this is about suturing the Constitution. A lot of people don't like to hear that, right? But I know that is in constitutional law, that is something that is talked about when you take constitutional law classes. What does that mean? What would that look like, the suturing of the Constitution? But, I think we for so long have tap danced around this notion of freedom of speech, right? And I know if you watch the documentary that I think in episode 3, it talks about the lawyer for the ACLU who said, well, if we take away freedom of speech, that's really dangerous, because it was about the Nazis marching in Illinois, in Chicago, right? I think in Chicago. And I know that created a lot of people leaving the ACLU at that point, right? Because of the comments that the attorney made about saying that would be dangerous to do. But I think there has to be some way to think about the First Amendment in a different way, right? Which again goes to policy, legislation, legal issues, because I think we've seen that QAnon, and I'm not saying they're responsible for this, but when people get indoctrinated into that type of thinking, we know that violence can happen after that, right? We know that people can be killed because of this indoctrination of this way of thinking. So I think that we've been too afraid of dealing with it. And I appreciate the documentaries, but I don't think that's nearly enough, right? I think we really have to look at these things in a more legal, policy, legislative way, and how we deal with this kind of misinformation. And I know people watch this, they might be like, oh, you can't mess with the Constitution. Well, I'm all about messing with the Constitution, because I know that the starts of these documents have a very racist beginning anyway, right? Totally. So, I think we have to really look at these documents a lot more carefully, and start thinking about, how is that a way of challenging this also?
Well, and what's disturbing is, of course, is that, the main legal theories that were making this very point within the ivory tower were critical race theory, right? That was, and it's almost like when you're looking at the way in which the right is responding, it's anticipating constitutional changes.
Totally.
And it's leveraging that as a kind of moral panic.
Yes.
That's the issue here, right? I don't want to dive into these kinds of, and again, Scott, maybe you could speak to this more because you're actually a psychologist, but there is a literature that I don't find, I don't know how helpful it is, and I know at recent NCA conventions it's been brought up, this literature where there's different studies that have been done about conservatives and liberals, about their kind of psychological dispositions and whether or not conservatives are like psychologically more prone to like moral panics, and like I don't know how helpful that is. I think it just sort of like turns conservatives into a kind of like abject other, which I don't think, I think it reproduces the very dynamics that we're talking about. It only intensifies the divide. It only becomes an excuse for like leveraging polarization more. But I do think though, one of the things that we do have to grapple with in this kind of, fascistic threat that we're dealing with here, that I think, Byron, you put on the table is this. And this, I think, this is something I was thinking about as I was watching the docuseries on HBO a second time. And that's this. What the part of the other political crisis here is that, when you watch the Watkins, the father and son duo that are administrating 8chan, and you look at the way in which conservative lawyers, try to then defend what they're doing on free speech grounds. One of the tensions that I found, and I'm thinking about this, and again, my dissertation gets into the First Amendment. I did a genealogy of corporate personhood, so I got into this, and one of the things that I find, they go back to Justice Holmes in that famous case in World War I about protest. And he advances this theory of the First Amendment, this theory of speech, which basically uses the metaphor of the market to describe speech. Like, well, we should just have a marketplace of ideas, and that has been a metaphor for framing free speech ever since the early part of the 20th century. And I think that the problem that we're dealing with right now is that we're not everybody has faith in this kind of narrative. And this is what I mean. If the people that are supporting QAnon and Trumpism were to find a way to take power by extra legal means, whether it's, and again, I think this is what, and getting back to what Steve Hunt was saying, and what everybody's been saying, we don't have enough of a sense of urgency. And that's the crisis too, right? I mean, there's a complacency here. And the idea here is this, if we don't take federal legislation to deal with what's going on in Texas and elsewhere, and if we allow the Electoral College to stay in place, and if we have another situation in 2024 where, some of these electors just won't be seated because the state legislatures won't let them, and they've written laws that allow that to happen. If we have this kind of aspirational fascist movement take power, all these arguments about free speech, they'll throw out the window. These are bad faith arguments that we're seeing from like Ron Watkins and the like, in episode 5, we're like, oh yeah, well, I want you to be able to have free speech so I can basically allow neo-Nazis to post whatever they want on my chat board. Yep. The moment those people are in power, they're not liberals in the classic sense of the word. They'll just find every reason to then suspend speech that they don't like.
Yep.
And that's the problem here, because and Hannah Arendt put this on the table when she was analyzing totalitarianism. And this is what I think we're seeing right now, is that what you're seeing in these movements, and it's only intensified since 2020. What you're seeing in these movements is exactly what Arendt observed with fascist movements in the 20th century. And that is this: they leverage liberal democracy against itself, right? They're making all these arguments about free speech, and then they're basically accusing the left or liberals or big tech of like suppressing their speech. Well, if they took power, we all know that they would suppress the speech of those who they oppose. and they would go beyond that.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the crisis, is that on the one hand, we have to protect speech, but we have to recognize that, this institution, as it's being understood, needs to be rethought. It needs to be reimagined for a digital era, an era of platforms. But also that, the very people who are making these arguments about free speech on the right are making them in bad faith. Totally. Because I see no scenario where, if you think that, you're trying to save babies from being eaten by George Soros and the left, if you've already dehumanized your political opponents, you're not going to justify giving them the right to speech. Do you know what I mean? That's the crisis.
It's 1930s Germany all over, right? First, we need to close down their businesses. Then we need to do more after that. I got to say, there's one institution in the United States that has a pragmatic view of information that's really doing an amazing job right now, and that's the federal judges, right? In other words, former mayor of New York, Giuliani, he's done. Why? Because they made a pragmatic judgment about the truthfulness of his statements that he's bringing to their court. He brings these things to their court. He has nothing to back it up, and they take away his ability to practice law. And what I'm saying there is there's sort of a pragmatic approach to information. It's not a metaphysical right or wrong. It's like, dude, show me some data. It's the same way I raise my kids. Yeah, okay, show me the data, right? And when you don't have any data, then you're sanctioned in the legal system because you're wasting people's time. Plus, it's the place where we work this out. And when I see things like Biden trying to keep everybody together, I think he's aware of just how robustly weaponized, how robust, thick the skin of this group is, and it's weaponized against it. In other words, if he says, okay, we're going to do it by ourselves, well, as you said, Steve, their rhetoric has anticipated that maneuver, and it's already weaponized against it. And so the long haul of pragmatism, right? The executive branch doing what it can to keep people together. I'm not saying that's what we should do. What I'm saying is that I see that as being the play that's being made. The judges are holding things down at the federal level regarding certain things, and then I'll stop there.
But I think here's the risk. I think the risk is that these federal judges become part of the deep state conspiracy.
Totally.
And I think that we have to be very, listen, I think that there's a real, if people were motivated to storm the Capitol, they could be easily motivated to assassinate judges as well. And I think that's, the law it can be a bulwark against things. It also, there's two metaphors in the law, right? It can be a sword, it can be a shield. It can be used to attack, it can be used to protect and then to insulate institutions of power. Yeah. And I think that, having studied the law for my own research, the law is a tricky thing. It's its own kind of autonomous realm. But it's also shaped by other forces. And I think that, it presents, it has its own kind of, within its own rules, certain kinds of arguments and certain kinds of standards hold. And this is why, again, we're seeing this with Giuliani. And again, this is why these cases involving these voting systems are so critical, right? Yes. Because I don't know if you've seen this, when Fox News is covering Trump's rallies, they have to, otherwise they'll get bankrupt and sued. They have to put these little disclaimers. The voting systems have denied this, right? Because otherwise they're really in it. But
right.
But again, that's why I think the filibuster is such an issue of our time. Because if we're going to basically allow minority rule in one branch of government that just holds up everything, then it's kind of game over, because then you can't ask the people to kind of just have this permanent kind of energy. Well, I should be careful how I phrase this, but there's a massive risk in just telling everybody year in and year out, this is the most important election of your life. This is the most important election of your life. This is the most important election of your life. I mean, you can only say that so much. And we had a huge turnout in 2020. And I remember we had a huge turnout in 2008. And then all of a sudden there's just like that there's a certain kind of fatigue there. And that's the thing that I fear. And I think that the right is sort of anticipating that.
Yep.
I think the anti-democratic movements are anticipating that. And that's why, again, the urgency has to be now. And, I was on a group chat yesterday, and I said, hey, if there's nationwide protests in DC for HR1 and voting rights, are you ready to go?
Yep.
I think we have to be ready to go. I think that this is a kairotic moment, and we have to be ready for that. We have to seize it.
You're absolutely right. Okay, so we've had a great conversation, and now we're going to move on to final thoughts before we wind this down. So, Byron.
Yeah, I think what I've gotten out of this conversation tonight, more than anything else, is there has to be an urgency to act on this, right? So, as I said earlier, and I'm sure we all know this, is that we're seeing a shift in QAnon, right? We're seeing a shift in what the new development will be for them. And I think it really is incumbent on us to start thinking about what is the response to this. And I think this is something we've been grappling with tonight. What is the response? What is the way we have to respond to this new movement, this new shift to running for office, right? Because that misinformation will continue into their running for offices, right? And because the ground rules have been set, right? The ground narrative has been set for them, which includes all these things like critical race theory, right? Or what they think is critical race theory, or non-binary gender issues, or sex education in the schools. I think this is our call, is to really think about how do we combat this now, right? Because more than likely, some of these people are going to get elected into office, right? Or they'll at least be on the ballots. So, what is our job? I think both as people at a university, as scholars, but also as human beings. Maybe the answer is just to go with Richard Branson to outer space. That's something else we can do something on, because I have a lot of thoughts about that. But what is the solution? What is the next step for us to take to combat this transition of Q from just being online to being in the political arena, which I think is probably, for me, one of the most urgent things that we need to be thinking about and talking about, and figuring out how to engage with our other citizens to ensure the safety, or to help us, because I don't think democracy is what it could be right now, but to keep that from being cut off at the legs. What do we do next?
Excellent. How about you, Nathan?
Yeah, I think the build on that is there is a tremendous amount of complacency, and from these conversations, I get such a powerful sense, not only of the urgency necessary, but also just how much we take for granted so many of our systems. Even things like the rule of law. I think we're seeing so many examples of it just being ignored, right? And so how do we reestablish that trust, even that our fellow citizens and neighbors will adhere, or will follow norms and conventions again? I mean, like just those basic lines of trust have been so deeply broken. I don't know where how we'll get those back. But I think relatedly, these ideas of where are the places that we can make change are so difficult because it feels like there's so many, lines and spaces where, things like Q are so deep and so seemingly, impenetrable. And I think, again, the conversations where we've talked about, changing discourse, I think that's really, really important. And, some of the things just locally that I'm involved with, from again, those perspectives of being on a university campus, being a so-called expert in media, issues related to literacy and education, changing that discourse about what it is we're doing to foster that better or stronger literacy, I think will be vital going forward. And again, I think that's one of those things we've just taken for granted for so long, what it means to be media literate. We've got to do so much better than we are in that case.
Excellent. How about you, Steve Hunt?
I think you're all brilliant. I'm really thinking about what you all said. Steve Rahko, what you said about Kairos and this moment that we face, I think is really important. Biden talked today about the enormous threat to democracy that we face and the extension of kind of Jim Crow era practices to what we're seeing in states like Georgia and Texas and elsewhere today. I think, Byron, what you said about we can't be complacent, this is a time for action, is absolutely true. This is a threat. This is an issue that is not going to easily go away. And certainly by sitting on our hands, it's not going to go away. That's not going to be helpful. Scott, I really like what you said about this whole thick skin effect, the notion that we need to avoid the information deficit fallacy, or the idea that if we just provide corrective information, everything's going to be okay, because clearly that is not the case. And Nate, I really, really like what you said about media literacy. And I think, that's one of the things that, as a person in higher education and thinking about civic education, teaching students communication, media literacy skills, that we need to struggle with and kind of rethink. It's clearly not just, teach them to be literate, teach them critical thinking. Those models that we've been practicing for the last 30 years obviously haven't worked. They haven't held up. And I think about some of the nuanced ways that we need to help students understand, Nate, some of the theories of networks that you talked about, how information is spread, how logarithms work, and how to spot misinformation. Those kinds of things, we need to take all of that to the next level. Because this generation that's coming up, right? I mean, we have the largest youth turnout in an presidential election in the history of the country. The number one issue that they talked about that drove them to the polls was issues related to systematic racism. This is a generation that is looking critically at what's happening in our society right now. And if down the road in the long term, we're going to be successful, it's probably going to be on the backs of these young people that we need to educate with these skills now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Steve Rahko.
Well, yeah, I'd like to echo everything you just said, Steve. I mean, I think that this has been a really, really clarifying conversation for me, hearing from all of you and the points of view that you're bringing into this. And I think that, we've talked about things that we can do. I mean, this is the first step. I mean, it's actually kind of bringing the techniques and the theories of critical academic discourse to bear on these problems and to create our own kind of dissemination of these ideas to compete with the other ideas that are being circulating in these digital spaces that this conversation is going to enter. I think one other thing that I think comes to mind that I'd like to end my thoughts in this conversation on are this. When I was rewatching episode 5, I think about the interview with the cicada. Remember the cicada game? And the guy who is behind the cicada avatar in the interview said something pretty interesting. He said, it's really hard to start a revolution, but what you can do is you can encourage an internal renaissance. And I found that really kind of telling as well. Maybe one move forward is to really kind of think about playing this game on those terms, right? Steal a tactic from them. And I don't know what that means in practice, but that is, I think Steve, when you're talking about Generation Z and how active this generation is, because I see it in my classroom too. What motivates them? I think that this is a generation that's very hungry for understanding the existential crises that they see their generation absorbing, whether it's race, whether it's climate. And I think I think one of the things that we can think about is, a lot of major changes occur with an awakening. I think that, a lot of people use that metaphor, but then what does it take to have that internal renaissance? And again, I think that's a challenge that I think we all, like everybody who cares about preserving democracy in the United States and around the world, everybody that cares about, building a more just and humane world, really should ponder. Because if that's been, what's activated the QAnon conspiracy, among other kinds of, modes of proof or other kinds of techniques of information dissemination, propaganda, whatever it is, then that can be leveraged by those who stand for a more humane and just world as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. My final words have to do with what are we going to teach? What are we going to do? And I think part of what we need to do is we try to teach younger people is to ask ourselves, what are we ignoring, right? What bubble have we created for ourselves that allows us to avoid certain types of suffering? And gamifying that. I know gamifying is a bad it sounds so bad to us older people, but actually allowing people to go into the world and discover through agency these things that you're trying to do. This is what QAnon's got right, man. I mean, you just put all this stuff on the screen and I press buttons and it comes up and it buttons and I'm just engaged and I am discovering, and you know what they are changing what they're experiencing. Whether or not it meets any criteria of truth is kind of beside the point, because what's happening is they're creating what Csikszentmihalyi calls a flow state, right? They're being in a complete sense in their world at that moment. And for me, we need to find a way for our kids. Byron and I, you were at a meeting and I said, what isn't civic engagement? What is it that we do in our lives that is not civic engagement? So get out of these conceptual rhetorical silos. This is healthcare, this is education, and create spaces for our students to discover instead of telling them what's right and wrong. That may sound like gamify to some people, but I think it's just a more coherent way of talking about how we learn and what being is. And this information age is just like so there. That's why, if you understand people, just ask gamers. How do you build a game? Well, how do you keep people engaged as long? And they'll tell you exactly the reinforcement criteria they generate to keep people engaged, and bringing that into our classrooms and being living witnesses to those values to our students. That's the long play. And for me, that's the one that works most effectively in the long term. I'll say one more thing and then I'll shut up. Whiteness has a lot of pressure on it right now, demographic pressure, and I would argue cultural awakening pressure. And the phase transition I talked about earlier is going to happen. And I think that things are so extreme on what we would call the QAnon side because they know the stakes. And sometimes I'm concerned we don't. Right? They know the stakes, and all of this is being organized to let them manage those stakes and get what they want. So my question to everyone is, what do we want? And then be that in the way we're with students and each other, and stop worrying about being right and wrong. Nathan, why don't you tell us where people can find you on social media?
All right. You can follow me. I am at Nate Carp, which is spelled N, the number 8, and CARP. You can also find my social media lab at ISUSOC_SMAC, and SMAC is spelled SMACC.
Fantastic. Steve Hunt.
You can find me on Facebook, and I'm also on Twitter at SKHunt2.
Fantastic. Steve Rahko.
You can find me on LinkedIn.
Very, very cool. Byron?
And you can find me on Twitter at Byron B. Craig. You can find me on Instagram, Byron Steve, and on Facebook.
Fantastic. You can find me on Twitter at @dark_loops. If you'd like to leave questions or responses to this podcast, please leave them right here on this YouTube page, or send an email to darkloopsproductions@gmail.com, and we'll gladly discuss it during the next conversation on the divide. So thanks to everyone for tuning in. Thanks to all of you fantastic gentlemen for being here. I always feel so rich after I finish one of these conversations. And thanks to everyone for joining us, and good night.